I've been reading and collecting comic books for more than half my life, and I find myself today at a crossroads. Am I just in a slump, or am I done with comic books forever? Welcome to Reading Crossbow. My name is Rob, and today I want to talk to you a little bit about comic books. Again, last month I did a special episode about the first issues of each of the new Ultimate comic book line from Marvel. And this month I wanted to do a part 2 to that. I expect this just to be a 2-part series, so not a regular thing. Because normally we do reviews for sci-fi and fantasy novels. But we're trying out adding in some additional content this year, and comic books seems like something I can talk about. Now, before I go into how I'm feeling today, let's talk about how I got into comic books. When I was in elementary school, my hometown didn't really have a comic book shop. The closest one was the next city over, about an hour away. So most of the time you could only really pick up comic books from newsstands like at the grocery store. Now, those comics were often just random issues that just got replaced at an irregular rate. So a friend and I, we basically kind of had a deal. Whenever we saw something we knew the other person liked, we'd try to get our parents to buy that one too. And then when we got together, we'd trade the ones that we'd bought for our friend. Now, this often ended up with some, duplicate issues and gaps in issues just because of the kind of irregular stocking and purchasing of these comic books. A few years later, though, a woman moved into a house near my friend's house, and she had a comic book store account. So out of her living room, you could just order comic books. Now, it wasn't a full store. She really didn't have much in the way of current or back issues. But if you knew what you wanted, she would basically sign you up for a pull list. And back then, I read a couple X-Men comics and Ghost Rider. And every week or two, we'd go in and she'd give us whatever had arrived in the meantime. You paid for it and went home. And that was kind of really where I first started collecting comic books. And also where I had my first pull list. If you're not really into comic books, this is how you kind of stay up to date with your whatever series you follow, is you sign up for a pull list. And they will pull every issue of that comic book for as long as you are good with your account. And I collected comic books that way for several years, but then as I started getting into, junior high or so, and started, becoming a little more interested in girls rather than comic books, and so I took a break. And comic collecting kind of went on hiatus for a few years. So skip ahead about 10 years or so. I'm working my first professional job, and I was going out to lunch with a coworker, and he mentioned he needed to make a pit stop on our way to lunch. Now, didn't really matter, so I was like, yeah, no problem. And it was kind of interesting because he pulled into a comic book shop. And we went inside, and the owner seemed to know him by name and grabbed him a pile of comic books and handed it to him. And, I had quite a bit of nostalgia just kicked in, and I was kind of almost instantly excited because this is really the first true comic shop I'd gotten to go to. So I started chatting with the shop owner about what I had used to read, and he told me about the current state of different comic books. And he specifically mentioned this brand new imprint, which was called Ultimate Comics. It was this new reimagining of the Marvel Universe, where You didn't really have to know the entire history of characters because it was all just getting rebooted for the current day and age. And this was a great time to get started because the whole new universe, this imprint, had only been out for a few months at that point. So within a few weeks, I had my own pull list set up, and my coworker and I would spend one day a week on our lunch going down to the comic shop and picking up our new comics. And it was great. That new imprint of Ultimate Comics really kind of hit the spot for me. It was very edgy, very modern for its time. And as described, you really didn't need to know anything about the history of the whole Marvel universe because it was being started over. But if you knew stuff, it would be kind of a lot of fun as things got introduced into the series. You would kind of be like, oh, this is how they're going to do Venom in this world. And it was, a great time to read, especially if you're a fan of Marvel Comics specifically. Now, it's kind of funny because my friend, he had always been a DC collector. And he also jumped onto this Ultimates and for the first time was enjoying Marvel comic books because for all the same reasons I was. So each of those different comic titles, the Ultimates, Ultimate Spider-Man, Ultimate X-Men, Ultimate Fantastic Four, each one of them was just kind of starting over with those characters, telling their stories in a new way. For the most part, they tried to be a little bit edgier, sometimes going a little too hard, such as the Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver story, which was a little too much. There was the funny story with the Incredible Hulk and his romantic rival, Freddie Prinze Jr. So each of these lines, fun and exciting. Now, eventually things did kind of go downhill, like pretty much once Ultimatum hit, pretty much everything thereafter was not as fun. And fast forward a couple more years and the Ultimate Universe was eventually gone. But by then I was collecting other titles. I'd even changed jobs and wasn't even able to pick up my comic books every week. So they just had a card on file. So they'd hold my comic books until I was able to get back to the store because I was now quite a ways away from the store. And for the most part, for the last 20 years or so, I've had an active pull list where sometimes it was like dozens of titles, sometimes maybe just a single comic for months. So in 2023, it was announced that the Ultimate Comics brand was going to be reborn. And I was immediately on board and I was excited about to read this latest iteration of the Ultimates comic imprint. I had great memories of the original one, and while I expected this would be all new, I didn't really expect this to be a continuation because the last one didn't end so well. So as I mentioned, Ultimate Comic Books brought me back into collecting comic books. And now the Ultimates line of comic books is showing me to the door. Last month, I did an episode where I very roughly, I'll admit, reviewed the first issues of the new Ultimate Comics. Some of the comics seemed promising, other ones I felt like they had kind of missed the mark. So, going from there, you might be wondering what went wrong with the other issues that led me to question my future of reading comic books. Well, I have collected 1 year's worth of Ultimate comic books, and yeah, my review of the first issue for almost all these series pretty much holds through for most of the rest of the series so far. Ultimate Spider-Man more feels like a memorial of what should have been. And I can't get over the feeling that this is just being set up for a new iteration of One More Day. Ultimate Black Panther feels more like it's inspired by the MCU than trying to do something new or interesting. Ultimate X-Men, while it is a very interesting story, kind of feels like this false promise. This should have been sold as a Momoka-verse story, and something else should have been using this title. Yes, I get it. Thematically, I can kind of see how this is an X-Men mutants kind of story. And it is an interesting story, but it's not the X-Men. And the Ultimates, the only title that actually seems to understand the core story of this whole imprint, it's just feels like it's treading water. So specifically, the Ultimates and Ultimate Spider-Man seem like they're each month, each issue just advances the story 1 month. So it's almost like a 24 like counter is ticking along. So if you remember from last month, I mentioned that the Maker, he's this villain that is responsible for the creation of this world. He's been trapped away for 2 years. Now, these comics have been now coming out for the first year. And they're coming out essentially in real time. So we have to wait 1 whole year to go by again for us to actually get to the core story of this world. And you can really feel it in the Ultimates, the Avengers analog of this world. So this book really just feels like a disappointment, because it feels like even the authors are getting tired of waiting. And wait we shall, because we have 12 more months until we actually get to the story here. Now, specifically with each title, there are these frequent and repeating issues across these titles that I find to be very frustrating. For example, now Ultimate Spider-Man is actually the title I like the most. It has the most interesting story from my point of view, but it suffers from a lot of the same problems that they all suffer from. And the biggest one, for the most part, is inconsistent art. Now, I have some pictures I'll bring up here. These are all supposed to be Mary Jane. All of these are from the same artist. And then you throw in, there's more than one artist. They change artist about every 2 or 3 books. Now, it's pretty jarring and irritating to have this much variance just within one title. For most of my collecting history, I would expect that any given story, whether it's an arc that's 3 issues, 6 issues, 12 issues, you would have a single team that would be responsible for creating that whole story. That gives you a consistent look and feel for the whole run of that storyline. Now, when that storyline ends, they might trade out to a different writer or a different artist, and things might change. And it might not be your preferred art style, but you just hold on to that pull list item until maybe the team changes again. Now, in all of these comic books, except for Ultimate X-Men, they change artists about every 2 to 3 issues. And even within, as I just showed with Mary Jane, even within a single artist, the art just seems wildly inconsistent. And here's the thing. This might seem a little petty, but comic books are a visual medium. If it was just about the story, that's what we got novels for. And there are some great novels featuring superheroes and comic book stories. If you're reading comic books, the art is an integral part of reading comics. And so if the art is wildly inconsistent, it's very frustrating. Over these comic books, the art is reliably changing, even within a single issue, and definitely across multiple issues, as each artist seemingly just changes things about their drawing from issue to issue, page to page, and then artist to artist. The only one with any consistency is Ultimate X-Men, and that's because there's only one person writing the whole comic book. So I find myself looking at this pile of comic books, 1 year of comics, and I ask myself that new phrase of, does this spark joy? And it doesn't. But it also doesn't really spark anger either. There's not really a lot of frustration or anger. I actually find myself just this empty void where I should be feeling a lot more emotional attachment with how this is going. And I don't. Instead of being excited as I read each of these issues, I just feel almost more depressed as I put each issue down. And I know Ultimate Wolverine is coming soon, but I'm not sure if I care anymore. These comic books, it's just a disappointment. So I find myself just sitting here debating on, do I close my pull list that I've had for 20 years with a great store, with a amazing staff who's always there to be helpful? Because I don't know of any active titles I want to buy. I've been talking to a couple friends who also read comic books, and most of their suggestions are either to just switch and go all digital, just buy a blanket account like with Comixology or whatever Amazon's thing is, and just read random issues. Another suggestion was just to go back and read some of the classic stories that maybe I never read the first time around. And those are good ideas, but I find myself not sure where I go from here. Do I just close my pull list and walk away? Yeah, I think I might. So here I am, looking for suggestions. Is there any titles that you're reading currently that you enjoy? Maybe there's some old trades that I should maybe look into while I wait out my current interest level. Whatever ideas you have, put it down below. I'd love to hear from you. And while you're there, could you hit the subscribe button? Our view numbers have actually been doing really well lately, but our subs haven't really changed at all lately. And it would be really helpful for us if you could hit the subscribe button if you're not already subscribed. One click for you is a huge help for us. And be sure to come back next week. We are going to be doing our first sci-fi and fantasy book reviews of the year starting next week.